Hello, I'm James Randi. Back in the 1980s, you may remember, one of the biggest woo-woo attractions was channeling. The notion that the luminiferous ether, or whatever, was stacked up with the souls of the departed who were still hanging around, eagerly waiting to be contacted by specialists with strange voices and affectations, but little talent outside of moaning and groaning. These channelers infested the TV studios, the assembly halls, and the churches of any country that could afford them. All over the USA, the UK, and most of Europe, local versions of this nonsense were suddenly on the scene, and the media, as usual, promoted them all because they were interesting, weird, and popular. Well, Australia was visited by one of these gurus who came and went in a spectacular style from which Down Under still hasn't quite recovered. In 1988, I was contacted by TV Channel 9 and asked for suggestions on what they might do to bring a certain degree of rationality back to their continent, where the moaners and groaners had begun to flourish like another infestation of rabbits. I opined that the best way of doing this was to demonstrate that we could literally create such a personality from scratch for the TV networks and newspapers to gobble up. A giant hoax using an inexperienced layperson and the same techniques that those rabbits were using, though less biologically direct, of course. I turned to my good friend, performance artist Jose Luis Alvarez, who at that time was not even aware that such spirit mongers were in existence, and thus a perfect subject for our project. He was exposed to a few hours of Jay-Z Night and Lazarus, among others, and he immediately fell into his own alter ego character, who we decided to name after Charlie, my rough and tough red cat, though we chose the Spanish version. Thus was reborn, Carlos, the 1,000-year-old spirit of a powerful guru who had kept company with several of Carlos Castaneda's creations in Latin America. The proper robes and amulets were selected. We needed Carlos to have the right vibrations, of course, and he always dressed in white. Come to think of it, he got to be a bit much when he was in his Carlos mode, and we couldn't wait for him to descend from heaven and down a beer with us mortals. Jose took on his friend George as a manager to the great Carlos. Both of them spoke Spanish, and we just hoped that Aussies would not detect a Bronx inflection when Carlos declared little-known truths of the universe to them. Channel 9 planned to present this item on the Down Under version of the 60 Minutes TV series, so they had a very satisfactory budget for the enterprise. Thus, George was decked out in managerial finery, pinky ring and all, as befitted a companion who fronted for an ancient guru. A few rehearsals, and the pair was ready to take on Australia. While we were grooming the star, the Channel 9 folks were busy preparing the public for his arrival on their shores. They set up a modest office on a short lease from which to distribute pamphlets, press releases, and bulletins, and every woo-woo agent, radio show, and amateur channeler fan club lined up to get passes to everything that Carlos might do while on their continent. We turned out a booklet titled The Wisdom of Carlos, which I'd whipped into existence in about 20 minutes. It was about as vapid as anything turned out by real channelers, so it was immediately accepted. Now, we did not inform the Australian skeptics of our project. We knew that just one leak of the fact that Carlos was not a bona fide faker, you follow my meaning, I'm sure, would have brought down the whole hoax, which had to be developed fully before we triggered the demolition, an art in itself. Any casual mention in a barber shop or a hint to a secretary pool at the bank that the Carlos caper was a stunt could be fatal to our project, so we had to leave the local skeptical community out of it until the denouement. The only persons who knew were the Channel 9 personnel. They were directly involved, of course, and our good friend Dick Smith, who assisted us with connections and suggestions, and journalist Philip Adams, who couldn't wait to see Carlos released in all his glory. But why would Carlos be so easily accepted? You see, we had a rather cute gimmick. Carlos could stop his pulse by a simple means that got by the most astute observers, except for one member of the Australian skeptics, who easily solved it. But none of the media paid any attention to him, of course. The story was far too good to die. This was another of the summer camp style of stunts, like the Uri Geller's moving a directional compass, which I'll now show you. Watch this. Carlos had a ping pong ball concealed in his armpit, under his shirt, of course, and would stop his pulse by simply pressing his arm down against his side, then releasing the pressure to make it surge back. It's that simple, folks. Let's take a look at what was broadcast eventually in Australia.
His name is Carlos, and you've probably seen him on television or mentioned in the press. Carlos is involved in the mystical field of channeling. That's when an ancient spirit supposedly takes over someone's body so that he may then walk around a stage offering his teachings to true believers. Channeling, it's one of the fastest growing in a long list of spiritual faiths.
God bless you, Dr. People.
It's a variation on reincarnation.
All right, I'll say, how are you this day of your time as you create time to exist?
The idea is that an ancient spirit decides to show up in someone else's body.
Beloved masters, indeed.
To New Age believers, this is all perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical.
Earlier, I spoke with a channel by the name of Jose Alvarez, a 19-year-old artist who is about to visit Australia. His body is frequently taken over, he says, by a spirit called Carlos.
First comes Terry Willesee tonight, who, in good competitive spirit, conducts a satellite interview with Carlos before he even leaves the United States.
What do you say to the skeptics who believe it's just an act that you put on a performance?
I do not say anything to them. I let Carlos do that. He does it pretty good.
The primetime current affairs show screens their satellite interview, complete with a registered nurse they hire to check Alvarez's pulse.
Okay, it's gone.
I am Carlos.
Carlos has some other homegrown homilies.
Crystals are great sources of power.
This is all good New Age stuff. Reincarnation, spiritual healing, and the critical role of crystals.
The earth itself is a gigantic crystal. All life on earth derived from crystal power.
Admission to the Carlos performance was free, but later the audience was invited to shop at a supernatural supermarket. But what had drawn all these potential new followers? Well, Carlos had foreshadowed his visit to Australia, not through a sign from the heavens or a natural disaster, but through a good old-fashioned public relations campaign. This is how it was organised. First, the key Sydney media received this glossy public relations handout. Now, inside there's a book of Carlos's teachings, various glossy photographs of the chap and other paraphernalia. Also available is a specially produced sound cassette and, available on demand, a specially produced video.
This is Radio WOOP in New York, and Carlos.
This videotape shows a New York radio interview by Carlos and one of his Broadway appearances. It all helps paint him as a mystic media celebrity in the United States. What response does the publicity handout produce? Could I ask you how you knew that this was occurring here today?
On TWT. Through TWT, yeah.
You saw it on television?
Yeah, we did.
Can I say this to you? If we didn't want you to have the opportunity to explain yourself, we would not have invited you.
We got plenty of opportunity.
Well, why did you come in this morning other than for a little bit more publicity?
At the end of a lively interview, the Mystics manager, Jorge Grillet, pulls a stunt that gets all of Sydney talking. He douses the redoubtable Negus when things get too hot.
I mean, it's too much. Let's get out of here.
I think we've proved our point.
I think it speaks for itself.
This clip is shown and reshown and makes newspaper headlines. Suddenly it seems the Sydney media is alive with water throwing and Carlos. The Mirror newspaper?
No!
Ray Martin's midday show,
George explained why he'd had to call Carlos back.
the Channel 9 News, all run with the story.
The event that I predicted will take place.
Channelers in the United States generate tens of millions of dollars a year. They rely on a public all too easily fooled, but they also depend just as heavily on a media overeager for new sensation.
The major lesson to be learned from this hoax was that it was the media, not we, who actually created and nurtured the Carlos entity, from nothing but the acting talent of Jose Alvarez and some carefully designed coaching. He became a character who was accepted as a genuine, though transitory, phenomenon. I'll tell you much more about this in our next video. I'm James Randi.
We thank you for watching this latest episode of James Randi Speaks. For more of James Randi and the Educational Foundation, make sure you visit randi.org.